The three traveled through the night, their hearts heavy with Elsidine's death. Behind them, Edward and Antigonus pulled Elsidine's caravan and his steeds along. Overhead, the full moon brought a sense of momentary peace to Antigonus, whom had tears streaming down his young cheeks. As dawn slowly began to peek over the northern mountains, Antigonus could see a multi-leveled city with a large cathedral to the gods looming over a keep located in the uppermost level of the city. Edward gave Antigonus a nudge and said,
"Here we are, lad. Bruma, your new home. It has a tavern with this lovely Norn lass. Big tits."
He made a motion with his hands in front of his chest, cupping an imaginary breasts, unlike Antigonus had ever seen. Antigonus laughed. Ahead of them, Rijard's wagon came to a halt as the Khajiit stood up and lifted his hand, showing some sort of stone tablet to the god. Antigonus tilted his head in curiosity as the god questionlessly heaved the gate open, allowing the caravan into the city. "What did Rijard do?" asked Antigonus.
"He has a merchant seal, handed to only the most renowned merchants in old Tamriel. It allows them into any city without hindrance. Alas, it's a seal of trust, and should you misuse it, the gods know death will be the least of your worries," replied Edward, smirking despite Antigonus's wide-eyed stare at that knowledge. The caravan finally made its way into Bruma, the gate closing behind them with a loud clank of its seals. As the caravan made its way through the city streets, Antigonus could see a man going from lantern to lantern, snuffing out the flames within as daylight began to shine its warmth into the city. Finally, the caravan came to a halt in front of a tavern called the Gerald View Inn, a rather well-kept structure unlike most of the others, which seemed to have a thin layer of soot covering nearly everything. Rijard waved his hand.
"I'll find us a room, Edward. Would you take Elstadine to the cathedral?"
Edward nodded and glanced down to Antigonus.
"Off you go, lad. Make sure we get a nice room, eh?"
Antigonus nodded and eased off the wagon, making his way into the tavern with Rijard. Inside, the place smelled of honeyed wood. Its architecture was exotic in nature, with dragon heads carved of wood and rune etchings along the wooden beams above. Antigonus looked around in pure awe, until all of a sudden his face
slowed into a rather soft and cozy surface.
Looking forward, Antigonus's face went pale, for as he looked up, there stood a rather large Nord woman, whom he had planted his face into moments ago.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean it,"
uttered Antigonus, who was horribly shy all of a sudden. The Nord woman was both tall and broad-shouldered, with wide hips and a muscled figure. However, most notable were her ample breasts, which would likely strangle a man dare he dwell too deep within them. The woman spoke with a laugh. "Oh, young boy, you wouldn't be the first. However, you're the first to say he was sorry." Rijard was snickering in the background, watching as Antigonus, the young boy, fiddled with his fingers behind his back nervously. "So, what brings you gentlemen here? A drink so early?" Antigonus glanced back to Rijard, who stepped forward and said,
"A pleasure to see you again, Eldred. We need a room for 3 nights at most."
The woman nodded with a small smile.
"Oh dear, Rijard, I won't ever forget our wrestling match under the moonlight."
Rijard's ears lowered bashfully.
"Not in front of the boy."
Antigonus blinked in confusion. Eldred pointed up the stairs.
"First room on the right. Enjoy your stay, gentlemen.
Let me know if you need anything." That night, Antigonus sat against the window, forehead pressed to the cold glass as he watched the street outside the tavern.
"Where's Edward?" he asked. "He should have been home by now."
Rijard bit down into a slice of meat, his golden eyes watching Antigonus closely.
"Why don't you ask him?"
Antigonus glared at Rijard. "Because I don't know where he is." Rijard grinned while chewing.
"He's at the cathedral."
Antigonus furrowed his brows. "I don't know where that is." Rijard then waved a chicken leg at Antigonus and said,
"Then stop worrying. A warrior does not worry of that which he cannot control."
Antigonus let out a slow exhale of breath, shaking his head in aggravation. He then pushed from the window and made his way over to Rijad, who continued to feast on the meat, bread, and milk that Heldred brought up short moments ago. Rijad pointed a bone at Antigonus and said,
I thought you killed with the bow, yet you failed with the sword. Why is that?
Antigonus broke off a piece of bread and shrugged, sliding pieces of meat onto it before saying, He was stronger than me. How would I have defeated him with a sword? Rijad grinned as Antigonus spoke.
Exactly.
His ears flickered as he continued.
Never fight your enemy with the skills he is good with. It is as useless as fighting fire with more fire. You fight fire with water.
He tapped Antigonus's cheek with the chicken bone, causing the young boy to glare at him as he rubbed his cheek. What if he has no weakness? Asked Antigonus. Rijal lifted the wooden cup of milk to his lips and took a long drink before setting it down. Antigonus smirked at the sight of milk clinging to his furry mouth.
Then you run, Antigonus. However, every hunter knows that all prey has a weakness. Sometimes it takes a little patience to see that.
By night's end, Antigonus lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling as his stomach growled from too much milk, meat, and bread. He looked across the room to Rijad. The sound of him sharpening his knife over a stone was like a repetitive heartbeat Antigonus couldn't help but find soothing. Antigonus parted his lips to speak. However, moments before he did, there was a sudden knock, knock, knock at the door before it swung open, and in stepped Edward, who said,
Sorry, lads. Sorry. Didn't mean to frighten ya. Heldred won't leave me alone.
Downstairs, Heldred shouted,
Edward, dear, I'm ready for a tumble.
Edward lifted his hand to his face and shouted back,
Shut up, woman. We just tumbled.
Edward slammed the door behind him. Rijad was laughing in his corner. Antigonus then asked, What's a tumble? Edward leveled his gaze with Antigonus and said,
I had to romp with her.
Antigonus blushed and muttered, Oh. Edward waved his hand dismissively.
Nothing wrong with that, lad. I know saying that to you may sound a bit odd, considering where you're born, but there ain't nothing wrong with a good romp, as long as both agree, of course.
Antigonus nodded and let his head rest back onto his pillow before asking, What now, Edward? What are you going to do with me? Edward sat down heavily in his bed, the entire bed frame bending to his weight.
Tomorrow, you'll meet with the physicians for the Legion. They'll decide if you're suited for the Legion and, more importantly, what role you'll serve within it.
Antigonus was suddenly very nervous, and it showed on his young face. Edward grinned widely and said,
Oh, don't worry, lad. My advice, however, is not to tell them that you can read. God forbid they make you a scribe.
Rijad then chimed in,
All scribes become fat. It's a curse, I think.
Both Rijad and Edward laughed at that, and Antigonus could only gulp down the nervous lump in his throat. It would be many hours before Antigonus would find sleep. The next morning, Antigonus made his way up into the inner part of the city alongside Edward, who spent the entire time leaning over and speaking to Antigonus.
Alright, so when we arrive, back straight, eyes front, and make sure they see those muscles on you.
Antigonus smirked at that and said, Shall I drink some ale in front of them as well? Make sure they know I'm a man? Edward barked out a laugh and said,
No, boy, no. Let them see you sober, huh?
Antigonus nodded and glanced forward. The banners of the Legion fluttering in the wind over a large courtyard filled with young men and women. Edward took hold of Antig's shoulder and said, Wait here, before making his way over to speak with one of the legionaries. Antigonus was awestruck by their armor. It was as if they were somehow above simple men. Antigonus knew this is what he had to become. Edward stepped up behind him and said,
Hey, lad, get formed out with the rest of them.
Antigonus rushed over to the large gathering of people who stood in front of a well-armored legionary with purple bands draped over his shoulders. He spoke with a firm voice.
Sons and daughters of Cyrodiil, I am late Antigo. All of you are here to join the Legion, and I assure you, all of you will have the chance. However, the Legion only takes the finest, and thus some of you may be turned away.
The man's piercing blue eyes glanced to Antigonus momentarily before he continued.
Following positions are available: Rankman, Forester, and Scribe.
He lifted his hand into the air.
A Rankman's duty is to fight on front lines, sword and shield to his enemy. Forester sent for our food in times of need, scout our enemy, and engage in guerrilla warfare. Finally, our scribes tend to the legates, to the nobility, and to our duke in all areas regarding the recording of their history, and their services to their homes.
A silence filled the gathering, as men suited in white robes made their way into the mass of recruits. Almost instantly, Antigonus could hear various positions being assigned, along with many being turned away.
Furthermore,
said Ontego,
as you've been assigned a role, your training will begin in a week's time at Fort Dragon's Claw, while the scribes will begin their training with their respective masters.
Antigonus's heart dropped when a physician stepped in front of him and eyed him over, grabbing and moving various limbs and seemingly exploring Antigonus's physique.
Age?
Asked the rather sickly-looking physician.
Too young for the rank and file troop.
The man wet his lips and narrowed his eyes on Antigonus.
Very well then, Scribe.
Edward let out a groan, and Antigonus's face went pale.